at 37,000 feet, in a cabin filled with the steady hum of engines. One woman asked for something so simple, yet was met with a wall of cold refusal: a bathroom, a basic human need. But on Flight 627, that request became the spark of a confrontation that would shake an entire industry. Dr. Naomi Carter, a woman of grace, intellect, and quiet power, found herself trapped between urgent necessity and the prejudice of authority. What happened next wasn't just a clash between passenger and crew. It became a countdown that pulled in the FAA, forced a diversion mid-air, and exposed a hidden culture of abuse. How did one quiet act of dignity turn into a nationwide scandal? How did a woman denied her humanity transform humiliation into justice, reform, and a legacy that touched millions of travelers? And what happened to the crew members who underestimated the very person they sought to silence tonight? You will hear the story that passengers still whisper about, the story that rewrote policy from 37,000 feet. If this story matters to you, if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic, as Flight 627 sliced through the stratosphere, somewhere high above the heartland. The Airbus A321 carried its 200 passengers across the vast country, leaving behind the glitter of Los Angeles and racing toward the gleam of New York. Inside the cabin, time moved in a softened rhythm. Screens flickered with muted movies. The scent of reheated meals and brewed coffee hung in the recycled air. The lights were dimmed just enough to make the rows of passengers look like a quiet theater audience. Dr. Naomi Carter sat in seat 14A, pressed gently against the cool window. At 42, she had perfected the art of traveling with grace. Her carry-on was tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her, her blazer folded just so, and her tablet already full of annotated reports. She was used to these flights commuting not for leisure, but for duty, summoned by panels, conferences, and government briefings. Aerospace medicine had made her life one of constant motion, but never without purpose. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Old habit. She liked writing longhand, even though she had every digital tool at her disposal. Notes about circadian rhythms, altitude physiology, and the subtle dangers of fatigue at high altitude filled the pages. Her pen glided calmly, even while turbulence gently nudged the fuselage. Beside her, Jonathan Carter adjusted his reading glasses. He was a man of sharp edges, impeccably tailored suit jacket, hair streaked with dignified silver, his features calm but alert. A corporate lawyer. Jonathan knew how to read people the way Naomi knew how to read data. Right now, though, he wasn't dissecting a contract. He was lost in the folds of a mystery novel. The spine bent at an angle that told Naomi he'd been carrying it around for weeks. Naomi glanced at him, her lips curving into a smile that barely touched her face, but lived fully in her eyes. These moments, rare and quiet, reminded her that she was more than just a consultant, more than a doctor summoned by federal agencies. She was a wife, a partner, and sometimes just a woman watching the land pass far beneath her. The cabin was serene. A child giggled 3 rows back. A young couple whispered, their shoulders touching. An elderly man in 13C snored softly, his newspaper slipping from his lap. Everything about the flight carried the illusion of peace. Naomi allowed herself to settle into it. Yet beneath the veneer of calm, her body whispered another story, a tightening in her abdomen, a faint pressure she had come to know too well. The medication was new, prescribed only weeks earlier to manage a minor autoimmune condition that had become stubborn in its persistence. The side effects, Her doctor had warned. Could be inconvenient. Sudden urgency. Difficulty waiting. She had brushed it off then. Now. As she capped her pen and set her notebook aside, she felt the warning crystallize into something sharper. Jonathan noticed the way she shifted in her seat. "You all right, Naomi?" His voice was low, laced with casual concern. She nodded, though it was a half-truth. "I'm fine. Just need to stretch my legs a bit." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his thumb tracing absent patterns against her skin. "Don't push yourself. We've still got a couple of hours to go." She smiled faintly. He always measured time like a lawyer, hours left, deadlines pending. For her, the clock ticked differently. It wasn't about the time until arrival. It was about the body's own impatient demands. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt. The chime had long since silenced, the sign overhead dark. She slipped gracefully into the aisle, steady despite the subtle roll of the plane. Walking past the rows, she felt eyes brush over her in that half-curious way people always did on planes. A stranger in motion was always a small performance. She ignored it, heading toward the rear galley. The lavatory sign glowed green, vacant. Relief washed over her in anticipation. She adjusted her pace, her movements fluid, determined, calm. She wasn't the kind of passenger to make a scene. If anything, she was the opposite, polite, composed, the sort of woman who could correct you with a smile and still leave you feeling grateful. The galley came into view, and there, blocking the door to the lavatory, clipboard in hand, stood a young flight attendant, Kelly Monroe. Blonde hair pulled tight, posture rigid, lips pressed into the kind of smile that looked more like a warning than a welcome. Naomi slowed, adjusting her expression into one of courtesy. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I need to use the restroom." But the moment belonged not to courtesy, nor to Naomi's quiet dignity. It belonged to Kelly, who lifted her palm in a halting gesture, a signal one might use to stop traffic, not to address a passenger. Her voice, when it came, was brisk. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The lavatory is closed right now." Naomi blinked, her gaze flicking to the glowing green light that read vacant. She paused, measured. She had learned long ago never to respond too quickly to unreasonable denial. "Is there a maintenance issue?" she asked. Kelly shook her head, her tone clipped. "We're beginning preparations for descent. The captain wants the cabin secured." Naomi tilted her head slightly. The flight map on the bulkhead screen caught her eye. Their little plane icon was still hovering over Nebraska, more than 90 minutes from New York. Initial descent wouldn't even begin for nearly an hour. She knew this. She had written policy on this. Her entire professional life had been built on understanding flight physiology and regulation. Her body whispered urgency. Her mind, sharper than the blade of Kelly's false smile, whispered caution. She stood still, her voice calm, almost soothing. "With all respect," Naomi said softly, "we're still quite some distance from our destination. I have a medical need. It will take only a moment." Kelly's eyes scanned Naomi in a flicker skin tone. Braids, posture, the kind of glance Naomi had cataloged all her life. A judgment wrapped in professionalism. A verdict delivered before the words were even spoken. Kelly's reply was smooth, but it carried a thin edge of condescension. "As I said, we're preparing for descent. Please return to your seat." The words hung in the air, sharper than the recycled chill of the cabin. For the first time since boarding, Naomi felt a small, burning ember spark in her chest. Not anger, at least. Not yet. Something else. Something she recognized the beginning of humiliation. Passengers nearby shifted. Subtle movements of curiosity. The man with the newspaper, now awake. The couple's whispers paused. A child's giggle silenced. Naomi inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the pressure in her abdomen and the weight pressing heavier still on her dignity. This was only the beginning. Naomi stood there, the green vacant sign glowing above the lavatory door, a beacon of logic that seemed invisible to the woman in uniform. Her body sent sharp reminders, waves of pressure that left her breath short. Yet she held her posture, shoulders steady, voice calm. "Is it truly closed?" Naomi asked again, gentler this time, almost inviting Kelly to reconsider. Kelly's smile hardened. "As I explained, ma'am, the lavatory is unavailable. We're securing the cabin." Naomi glanced down the aisle. Flight attendants still pushed carts. Passengers ordered drinks. Trays clicked open. Nothing resembled descent prep. Her eyes returned to Kelly, a flicker of quiet disbelief there. But her words were still courteous. Perhaps the captain would allow an exception. Naomi offered. It would be less than a minute. Kelly's chin lifted slightly, posture stiffening in a show of authority. "There are no exceptions. Please return to your seat." A sharp pang radiated through Naomi's abdomen. She pressed a palm lightly against her blazer. Steadying herself, pain made her want to snap, but her discipline held firm. Years in lecture halls and government hearings had taught her how to remain composed under pressure. Inside, though, her thoughts spun. Why this hostility? Why the refusal, when the light clearly read vacant? Why the tone that dripped with dismissal? As though she were not a paying passenger, but an intruder. She had seen this look before. In boardrooms, at medical conferences, on the lips of strangers who assumed they knew who she was before she ever spoke. A gaze that measured skin first, credentials later. Her mind fought to keep the rising tide of anger in check. "Not here. Not now." "Very well," Naomi murmured, voice quiet, almost gentle. She turned, her steps deliberate, controlled, walking back toward her seat with the dignity of someone who refused to be rattled in public. Jonathan looked up the moment she returned, his brow furrowed in concern, the novel forgotten in his lap. "You couldn't go." "She refused me," Naomi answered softly. Her voice carried calm, but Jonathan saw the tightness around her mouth, the strain in her eyes. "On what grounds?" "Preparations for descent," Naomi said, lowering herself into the seat with careful grace. She drew a steady breath, managing the pain. "We're still more than an hour away." "She's lying. Jonathan, it's not procedure. It's something else." His jaw tensed, the lawyer in him cataloging every detail. "Did you tell her it was medical?" "She wasn't interested," Naomi whispered. "She threatened to report me as non-compliant." Jonathan's lips parted in disbelief, then pressed into a thin line. He leaned closer, his voice low. "That's absurd. Non-compliant. For needing a restroom when the seatbelt sign isn't even on." Naomi nodded once, her composure outwardly intact, though her abdomen throbbed. Her voice carried the kind of calm that was sharper than a shout. "That's exactly what she said." Jonathan inhaled through his nose, slow but heavy. He had faced aggressive corporate lawyers, hostile judges, even unruly juries. But this was different. This was his wife, denied something as basic as human dignity. The fury simmering inside him was controlled, but only barely. "I'll go talk to her," he said finally, his tone firm. "No," Naomi cut in quickly. Her hand found his wrist, gripping gently but with strength. "Don't escalate. She's already painted me as a problem. If you step in..." She'll use it. She'll twist it. His eyes searched hers, frustration burning in them. So what? We just sit here while you're in pain? Her face softened, though the pain was etched clearly now in the lines at the corners of her eyes. We wait, for the right moment. The words landed heavy between them. Jonathan clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He respected her instincts, even when every protective impulse told him to fight. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. The hum of the engines pressed around her, a dull background noise to the sharper throb in her abdomen. She counted breaths, in, out, each one a fragile thread holding back the tide of discomfort and humiliation. Across the aisle, a man lowered his newspaper. He had witnessed the small exchange near the galley, his eyes narrowing as he studied Naomi's pained expression. 2 rows back, a young couple glanced at each other, whispers passing between them. Even without words, the cabin was beginning to notice. Minutes ticked by like slow drops of water. Then, the sound of measured footsteps approached. Naomi opened her eyes to see another uniformed figure stop at their row, this one older, authority etched in the tilt of her chin, the weight in her stance. The name tag read, Linda Graves, the purser. "Is there a problem here?" Linda asked. Her tone was flat, professional on the surface, but carrying the unmistakable undertone of accusation, as though the problem was not what Naomi had endured, but Naomi herself. Jonathan spoke before Naomi could. His voice was calm, precise, almost court-like. "Yes, there is. My wife has a medical condition that requires her to use the lavatory urgently. Your colleague refused her access, claiming the cabin is preparing for descent. Clearly, that is not the case." Linda's eyes flicked from Jonathan to Naomi, expression unreadable, lips pressed tight. Behind her, Naomi caught sight of Kelly hovering near the galley, arms folded, smirk faint but undeniable. The purser's voice, when it came, was deliberate. Kelly was following procedure. The forward lavatory is reserved for first class, and the rear lavatories are being prepared for landing. There's nothing I can do. The lie was clean, delivered without hesitation. But Naomi knew better. She knew regulations like scripture, and she knew when they were being twisted into armor for prejudice. She drew in a steady breath, meeting Linda's eyes directly. Her voice, when it came, was low, but edged with quiet authority. "That is categorically false. I am a physician. My specialty is aerospace medicine. I consult for the FAA. I know the protocols. Denying a passenger with a documented medical need access to a lavatory is not procedure. It is a violation." For just a second, Linda's expression flickered. A crack in the armor, but it hardened again quickly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as though confiding. "Claiming to be with the FAA is serious, ma'am. I'd be careful what you say." Naomi felt Jonathan stiffen beside her, his hands curling into fists on his lap. Linda's words dripped with condescension. With that casual dismissal Naomi had endured her entire life. It wasn't just no. It was the assumption that she was lying, that she was less credible than the uniform in front of her. Pain shot through her abdomen, sharp, insistent, but beneath it, a cold clarity settled in her chest. This was no longer about the restroom. This was about dignity, about prejudice hiding behind the flimsy shield of authority. Her eyes shifted from Linda to Kelly. The younger attendant stood watching, lips curled in that same smug look. 2 women, united not by procedure, but by something far older, far uglier. Naomi turned back to Jonathan. She said something so soft, Only he could hear. His eyes widened for a moment. Then he nodded. The understanding passed between them like a secret code. Naomi reached slowly for her bag, the movement deliberate, graceful, despite the fire in her abdomen. She pulled out a second phone, sleek, black, encrypted, her work phone. Linda's eyes followed the motion, misinterpreting. "Ma'am, recording crew members is against policy," she said sharply. Naomi didn't look up. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping with precision. The message was short, clinical, heavy with regulatory language. It was not a recording. It was not a complaint destined for a corporate inbox. It was a direct message to Marcus Hill, FAA Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. The timestamp read 2:13 p.m. Central Time. Jonathan's hand closed gently over hers for a moment, steadying. "How long?" he whispered. Naomi's eyes, still on the glowing screen, carried the calm of someone who knew exactly what came next. "Not long," she murmured. Inside the cabin, trays clinked. A baby fussed softly. Passengers settled back into their distractions. But for Naomi, Jonathan, Kelly, and Linda, the clock had already started ticking. 10 minutes. That was all it would take to turn the sky itself against injustice. But Naomi kept her phone close, her message already sent into the invisible streams above the clouds. To any outsider, she appeared calm, her body angled slightly toward the window, one hand resting on the armrest. Only Jonathan could sense the storm beneath her composed exterior, the tension in her jaw, the steady but shallow rhythm of her breathing. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances toward Naomi and the two flight attendants. He had seen the exchange. Even if he didn't know the details, people were watching. The cabin had its own quiet language, and right now that language said something isn't right. Kelly hovered near the rear galley, pretending to flip through a manifest sheet but sneaking glances at Naomi as though she had won a small battle. The faint smirk never quite left her lips. To her, the situation was clear. She was in control, wearing the uniform, wielding the rules. Naomi was just another passenger, one she could dismiss with a wave of her hand. But to Naomi, it was different. Every detail pressed itself into her memory, the raised palm that had stopped her, the clipped tone, the way Kelly's gaze had traveled from head to toe in that brief moment of judgment. It wasn't new. It had happened in restaurants, in boardrooms, in quiet waiting areas where assumptions were made before she ever opened her mouth. She remembered being a young medical student, stopped outside a restricted hospital corridor, told she didn't belong until she flashed her badge. She remembered the subtle surprise in colleagues' eyes when she delivered a flawless presentation. She remembered the tired smile of her mother telling her, "You'll have to be twice as good, Naomi, twice as patient, twice as strong." That echo rang now in the recycled air of Flight 627. Her abdomen tightened again, forcing her to press lightly against her blazer. The pain was real, urgent, but so was the weight of being reduced, once again, to someone's stereotype. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice soft but urgent. "She's watching you, like she's waiting for you to slip. Don't give her that." Naomi gave the faintest nod. "I won't." But inside, her thoughts raced. How long until Marcus read the message? Would he act? Would the system move quickly enough to protect her before the pain overwhelmed her? The purser, Linda, returned to the galley, speaking quietly with Kelly, their heads bent together, voices hushed, but their body language unmistakable in alliance, forged not in truth, but in shared prejudice and power. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know the tone, dismissive, patronizing, certain they had neutralized a problem passenger. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Her mind wandered, not by choice, but pulled into the depths of memory. She was 16 again, sitting in the back of a classroom, raising her hand to answer a complex biology question. The teacher, not even glancing her way, called on someone else. Later, when she pressed politely, the teacher said, "I didn't think you'd know that one." She was 25, at a medical conference in Chicago. She had presented data on high-altitude pulmonary edema. Afterward, a senior physician congratulated her, then added, "You speak so well. I didn't expect that." Now she was 42, seated in the economy cabin of an airliner, denied the basic dignity of relieving pain, forced into silence while two uniformed women congratulated themselves for putting her in her place. Her eyes opened. She didn't let the memories harden into anger, though they could have. Instead, she let them settle into the same space where she always stored them, the place that fueled her discipline, her patience, her quiet strength. Around her, the cabin stirred. The young couple 2 rows back whispered more audibly now, their eyes darting forward toward Naomi and then back to each other. The man with the newspaper rustled the pages noisily, as though trying to mask his unease. A teenager across the aisle slid out an earbud. Curious, the humiliation wasn't private anymore. It had become public, witnessed, silently judged. Jonathan leaned closer again, his hand brushing hers. "Naomi, your face, people can see you're in pain. Maybe that's not the worst thing. Maybe it's good they see it." She didn't answer at first. The thought was risky. She never liked exposing her vulnerability, especially to strangers. But perhaps Jonathan was right. Let them see. Let them understand this wasn't a game of petty rules. This was a human being in distress. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, letting her hand remain pressed against her abdomen, her expression composed but clearly strained. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't perform. She simply allowed the truth to be visible. Kelly caught the sight as she moved down the aisle with a trash bag. For a flicker of a second, her confidence faltered, but then she straightened, tossing a glance toward Linda as if to say, "I'm holding the line." Naomi watched her pass, the pain sharp now, but her mind sharper. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to make a scene. The message was already in the airwaves, heading straight toward a man who knew exactly who she was, and what it meant that her warning had come from 37,000 feet. The clock was ticking. Still, time moved slowly in the cabin. Each minute felt stretched thin, every second punctuated by the whine of the engines. Naomi's thoughts dipped inward again. She questioned herself, why hadn't she pushed harder? Why had she walked away when her need was so urgent? Would compliance be mistaken for weakness? Her mother's words returned patient, strong, measured, always. Jonathan broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me wants to stand up, call them out in front of everyone, make the whole plane see what they're doing." Naomi turned her head, her eyes locking with his. "And then we become the problem passengers. That's how they win." "Not this time." His shoulders sagged slightly. He hated it, but he understood. Linda appeared again, checking belts and trays, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She gave Naomi a cursory glance, the kind you give someone you've already dismissed. Naomi met it with steady calm, not flinching, not looking away. Two forces met silently in that gaze: authority dressed in polyester and dignity dressed in pain. Passengers noticed. The quiet tension was spreading like static. They might not know the details, but they felt the imbalance. One woman in row 12 leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Why won't they let her go? She looks sick." Naomi didn't hear the words, but she felt the shift. The cabin was no longer indifferent. It was awakening. And deep inside, she knew once witnesses began to pay attention. Stories no longer stayed in the shadows. Her phone vibrated once against her lap. Not the full reply she was waiting for, but the confirmation of delivery. Message received. Jonathan saw it too. His eyes met hers. A spark of cautious hope flickering there. "How long, Naomi?" he whispered. She exhaled slowly, the pain twisting inside her, but her voice steady. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Kelly passed again, her smirk thinner now, her movements sharper. She sensed something, though she couldn't name it. Naomi didn't look at her. She didn't need to. Her strength came not from uniform or procedure, but from knowledge, patience, and the certainty that the sky itself could deliver justice. The prejudice was real. The humiliation was sharp. But above it all, Naomi remained what she had always been: composed, steady, unshakable. The storm was coming. Naomi's abdomen throbbed with a sharp urgency that refused to be ignored. Each passing minute felt like sand slipping through a narrow glass, each grain a reminder of how fragile control could be when the body rebelled. She sat tall, her posture unyielding, though every muscle begged her to double over. To the passengers around her, she looked serene, maybe tired, maybe in discomfort, but to Jonathan, she was a fortress under siege. Kelly Monroe walked down the aisle again, this time with a tray of drinks for first-class passengers. She didn't look directly at Naomi, but her chin lifted ever so slightly as she passed, a gesture of silent victory. Naomi caught it, but she didn't let it show. She turned her eyes toward the window instead, watching clouds drift by like silent witnesses. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice pitched so only she could hear. "This isn't sustainable. If they think they've won, they'll keep pressing. And you." He cut himself off, his eyes flashing as he took in her tightly folded hands. Naomi gave the faintest nod, lips pressed into a line. "I know." Her pain wasn't the only thing gnawing at her. It was the humiliation. Not just being denied a basic need, but being dismissed so casually, as if her words meant nothing. Her presence meant nothing. She had built her life on precision, science, and the respect of colleagues who depended on her expertise. Yet here she was, reduced to pleading for a restroom, her professional identity erased by the judgment of 2 women in polyester uniforms. The injustice burned, but so did the resolve. Linda Graves approached again, clipboard tucked under one arm. Her movements carried authority, the kind honed from years in the aisle, years of giving orders and being obeyed. She stopped near Naomi's row, her gaze sliding past Jonathan and settling on Naomi with a look that mixed irritation with impatience. "Dr. Carter," Linda said, her tone professional but cool. "I need to ask you to remain seated for the remainder of the flight. We can't have disruptions in the cabin." The words landed like a gavel. Naomi blinked, her calm finally pierced. "Disruption," she repeated quietly. "Yes," Linda said firmly. "You've already spoken to my colleague. We can't revisit the same issue over and over. It distracts the crew and unsettles other passengers." Jonathan's voice came out sharper than before. "Unsettling passengers. Do you know what's unsettling, Miss Graves? Watching your wife, who has a medical condition, be denied access to a lavatory while your staff invents procedures that don't exist." Several heads turned at his words. The young couple 2 rows back exchanged startled looks. The man with the newspaper lowered it completely now, staring openly. Linda's lips tightened. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but rules exist for a reason. Our job is to keep this cabin safe." Naomi shifted forward slightly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Safety is not served by ignoring medical necessity. It is compromised. You know that. And if you don't, then you are dangerously unqualified for your position." For the first time, Linda's expression cracked. Her eyes narrowed. Defensive. "Watch your tone." "Ma'am." The words hit like a slap. "Watch your tone." It was the phrase Naomi had heard all her life in one form or another. Be polite. Be quiet. Don't challenge authority. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, then spoke with deliberate precision. "My tone is measured. My words are factual. You are creating a preventable medical emergency. If that is how you define safety, then perhaps you should revisit the FAA's own regulations." Gasps and murmurs stirred among the passengers nearby. The atmosphere shifted, no longer a private standoff, but a spectacle unfolding in real time. Kelly reappeared at Linda's side, her smirk fading when she saw the eyes of passengers fixed on them. Jonathan's voice cut through the tension, low but commanding. "We'll let the proper authorities decide who's in the wrong here." Linda glanced at Kelly, a silent exchange flashing between them. They were still united, but cracks showed in the facade. Naomi could sense it. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by a flicker of doubt. Inside, Naomi's resolve hardened. Her body might be weakened by pain, but her mind was sharper than ever. She wasn't just enduring humiliation, she was documenting it, embedding every detail into memory. She knew the system, the rules, the loopholes, the exact language that regulators respected. And she had already placed the first stone in motion with her message. Still, doubt whispered in her own mind. What if Marcus was busy? What if her message was lost in a flood of reports? What if the help she counted on never came? She closed her eyes briefly, hearing her mother's voice again, patient, strong, twice as good. Her abdomen clenched sharply, forcing her to bite back a wince. Jonathan's hand found hers, steadying, grounding. His thumb pressed against her palm in a silent code they had developed over years of facing battles together. "You are not alone." The purser straightened, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "This conversation is over," Linda declared, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by those watching. "If you continue to resist instructions, we'll have no choice but to involve the captain." Naomi looked directly at her, her expression unflinching. "Good. Please do." The firmness in her voice startled even Jonathan. It startled the passengers nearby, too, who exchanged whispers. Naomi rarely raised her voice, rarely confronted so directly. But this was different. This was not just about her bladder. This was about dignity, fairness, and the right not to be dismissed because of who she was. Linda's eyes narrowed, but she didn't reply. She turned sharply, gesturing for Kelly to follow. The two retreated to the galley, their whispers hushed but urgent now. The man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Jonathan. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw what happened earlier. That wasn't right." Jonathan gave a tight nod, his lips pressed thin. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the man, her face composed despite the pain. "Thank you," she said simply. The man nodded back, then settled into his seat, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful. He was not the only one. The cabin was no longer a passive backdrop. It had become an audience. Naomi leaned back, closing her eyes again, drawing strength from silence. She pictured Marcus in Washington, his sharp eyes scanning her message, his mind already calculating the gravity of what was unfolding. She trusted him. She had to. Her abdomen throbbed again, a reminder that time was short. Jonathan's grip on her hand tightened briefly, and she gave the faintest squeeze in return. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was full of meaning. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching wider than the last. Naomi Carter sat rigid in her seat, her breathing slow, measured, every inhale a small act of control. The pain in her abdomen had become a steady drumbeat, relentless but not yet overwhelming. Her discipline kept it at bay, though she knew her body was near its limit. Jonathan sat beside her, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the aisle like a sentry. His hands opened and closed against his thighs, every instinct telling him to rise, to fight, to confront, but Naomi's earlier words still echoed in his mind. "Don't escalate. Not yet. In the galley." Linda Graves and Kelly Monroe whispered in low voices, their posture betraying their unease. Linda's authority was no longer ironclad. It had begun to fray under the weight of Naomi's calm defiance and the attention of nearby passengers. Kelly's earlier smugness had wilted into a forced neutrality. She tried to appear professional, but her eyes darted nervously toward Naomi more often than she intended. The cabin itself had shifted. The man with the newspaper had folded it neatly and set it aside, his eyes sharp with curiosity. The young couple who had whispered earlier now leaned forward slightly, straining to catch fragments of what was happening. A teenager 2 rows up had paused his music, earbuds dangling as he listened. Naomi could feel the collective gaze. She didn't welcome it, but she didn't shrink from it either. Let them see. Let them witness the truth that she had asked politely, explained her need, and been denied out of something far colder than protocol. Her phone buzzed once. She slid her hand over it casually, angling the screen so only she and Jonathan could see. A single checkmark had already confirmed delivery. Now, a second mark. Message read. Jonathan caught the flicker of relief in her eyes. "They got it," he whispered. Naomi gave the faintest nod. "Yes. He's reading it now." Jonathan exhaled through his nose, the first real breath of hope since the ordeal began. "Then they'll act. They will," Naomi said quietly. "Marcus doesn't ignore messages like mine, especially not mid-flight." Still, doubt pricked at her. She had worked with Marcus Hill before, had seen his efficiency, his near-photographic memory of FAA codes, his intolerance for negligence. But this was different. This was her, vulnerable, humiliated, and needing him not as a colleague but as an advocate. Would he move quickly enough? Her abdomen spasmed again, sharper now, and she clenched her jaw. Jonathan's hand closed over hers, grounding her. He didn't speak, but his eyes begged her to hold on. In the galley. Linda straightened her uniform and started down the aisle again, clipboard in hand. She stopped by Naomi's row, her voice controlled but laced with frost. "Dr. Carter, I'm reminding you one final time. Remain seated. Do not attempt to use the lavatories. If you continue to resist, the captain will be informed." Naomi opened her eyes, steady and unflinching. "By all means," she said, her tone soft but sharp as glass. "Inform the captain. In fact, you may want to do so immediately." Linda's brows furrowed. She hadn't expected agreement. Her authority depended on resistance. Naomi's calm acceptance unsettled her. She gave a curt nod and walked briskly toward the cockpit. Kelly lingered for a moment, her eyes locking with Naomi's. For the first time, there was no smirk, just confusion, maybe even fear. She turned and followed Linda. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice low and tense. "You've rattled them." Naomi allowed herself a small exhale, though her abdomen screamed for relief. "Not me," she murmured. "The truth." In the cockpit, Captain Amelia Rourke was reviewing navigation charts with her first officer when Linda entered. The captain looked up, mildly irritated. "What is it?" "Linda." "There's a passenger in 14A refusing instructions," Linda said crisply. "She claims she has a medical condition, but she's disruptive. If she continues, I recommend we mark her as non-compliant." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Non-compliant." "Over what lavatory access?" Linda replied. The first officer frowned. "But the seatbelt sign isn't even on." Linda stiffened. "We're preparing for descent." Captain Rourke checked the flight map. They were still over Indiana, cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet. Descent wouldn't begin for at least 40 minutes. Her eyes narrowed. "Preparations for descent." "That's not accurate." Linda faltered. She was insistent, and she claimed to consult for the FAA. The captain's gaze sharpened. She turned fully in her seat. "What was her name? Carter? Dr. Naomi Carter," Linda said, her voice dropping. Recognition flickered in the captain's eyes. She wasn't personally acquainted with Naomi, but she had heard the name. An aerospace medicine specialist, a woman whose papers had influenced fatigue protocols and hypoxia response training, a name respected across the industry. Captain Rourke's stomach tightened. If Linda had dismissed her, lied to her, threatened her, then this wasn't just a passenger issue. This was a crisis. Before she could respond, the comm light blinked. ATC was calling. The first officer answered, his face paling as he listened. "Captain, Chicago Center says we're to divert to O'Hare immediately. They said the order came from the FAA." Linda's face went white. "Divert for what?" The first officer looked at her coldly. "A passenger medical emergency? Your crew failed to report." Captain Rourke's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Linda, go back to the cabin. I'll handle this. And for your sake, I hope every word you've told me is true." Linda swallowed hard and left the cockpit, her clipboard trembling slightly in her grip. Back in 14A, Naomi felt it, the subtle change in engine pitch, the faint banking turn. She opened her eyes, glancing at the flight map. The tiny plane icon had shifted, no longer pointing toward New York, but veering north toward Chicago. Jonathan noticed it too. His voice was hushed with awe. "They're diverting." Naomi gave a single nod, her composure unshaken. "Yes, the system is moving. Around them." Passengers began to murmur. "Are we landing early?" one woman whispered. "What's going on?" said another. The air shifted from curiosity to quiet unease. The man with the newspaper leaned toward his wife, whispering, "I think it's her. They wouldn't let her use the bathroom earlier." His wife gasped softly, glancing toward Naomi with wide eyes. Within minutes, speculation spread through the rows. Fragments of the truth circulated like wildfire. A woman denied. A medical need. The crew's cold refusal. Naomi sat still, regal in her silence, the embodiment of grace under fire. Jonathan's hand rested on hers again, steady, proud. The clock had ticked exactly 10 minutes since her message left her phone. 10 minutes to unravel years of prejudice disguised as procedure. 10 minutes for the sky itself to deliver judgment. The engines hummed with a deeper resonance as Flight 627 banked gently northward. Passengers felt the shift, subtle yet unmistakable. Naomi Carter opened her eyes, the faint arc of the horizon tilting through the oval window. She didn't need the flight map to confirm it. They were no longer bound for New York. Jonathan leaned closer, whispering into the charged silence. "That's it, isn't it? They diverted." Naomi's lips curved into the smallest acknowledgement. "Yes, Chicago." Her voice carried no triumph, only calm certainty. She had known Marcus Hill would act swiftly. She trusted him. And now the reality of that trust echoed in the engine's altered rhythm. Around them, murmurs rippled like a current through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, looking at one another with questions in their eyes. One man spoke in a hushed tone. "Why are we turning?" A woman farther down asked, "Didn't the captain say nothing was wrong earlier?" The whispers merged into a low buzz of speculation. The man with the newspaper leaned toward his wife again. "It's about that woman," he muttered, nodding discreetly toward Naomi. "They wouldn't let her use the bathroom. I saw the whole thing." His wife's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," he said grimly. "And now the FAA is involved. Has to be." Naomi felt their eyes on her, felt the swell of quiet recognition moving through the rows. She sat tall, pain burning inside her, but dignity radiating outward. She was not just enduring, she was embodying the truth of what had happened. Jonathan tightened his grip on her hand. His voice carried both pride and awe. They underestimated the wrong person. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. At the front of the cabin, Linda Graves emerged from the cockpit, her face pale, clipboard clutched too tightly in her hand. Kelly Monroe trailed close behind. Her smirk long vanished, replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. Passengers watched them return, whispers sharpening into suspicion. Linda avoided their gazes, focusing on the galley as if it could shield her from judgment, but the weight of 100 eyes followed her every move. Jonathan noticed, leaning slightly toward Naomi. "The tide is turning," he murmured. Naomi's abdomen throbbed again, sharp and insistent. She shifted in her seat, suppressing a grimace. "Not fast enough," she whispered. Jonathan's heart ached at her restraint. He wanted to stand, to shout, to call out the injustice for all to hear. But Naomi's calm had anchored him this far, and he clung to it still. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a passenger medical situation requiring immediate attention, we will be diverting our flight to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 25 minutes. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened as we prepare for arrival." Gasps and murmurs erupted instantly. A passenger called out, "Medical situation." Who another whispered, "It has to be her." "Right." Several heads turned openly toward Naomi. She didn't flinch. She met their eyes with quiet composure. She didn't seek their sympathy, but neither did she hide from their recognition. The truth was out, even if only in fragments. Jonathan leaned close again, his voice low. "They know now. Everyone knows." Naomi exhaled slowly. "Good. In the galley?" Kelly's hands trembled as she stacked cups, her movements clumsy. She felt the stares like heat against her skin. Whispers weren't just words anymore. They were judgment, forming into something heavier. She glanced at Linda, hoping for reassurance, but found none. Linda's face was rigid, eyes fixed ahead, her authority unraveling thread by thread. Passengers began piecing the story together. The young couple 2 rows back whispered urgently. They wouldn't let her go. "Can you believe that that's insane?" The teenager who had removed his earbuds muttered under his breath, "That's messed up. Loud enough for others to hear." The social current had shifted. Authority no longer belonged to the uniforms. It belonged to the truth that everyone could feel hanging in the recycled air. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, focusing on her breath. Each inhale steadied her. Each exhale released the sharp sting of humiliation. She reminded herself that this wasn't just her fight. It was larger, heavier, a reflection of something systemic. She carried it not just for herself, but for every person who had been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. Her phone buzzed again in her lap. This time it was a reply, short but decisive. Acknowledged, diversion in progress. FAA officials on standby. Jonathan saw her glance and the faint nod that followed. "It's confirmed." "Yes," Naomi said softly. He squeezed her hand, relief washing over his features. Then it's almost over." Naomi didn't answer. She knew better. This was only the beginning. The descent began sooner than expected, engines throttling back as the aircraft angled gently downward. The skyline of Chicago would soon rise into view. Passengers adjusted their seat belts, their chatter subdued now, tinted with unease. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Naomi. Others stared at Linda and Kelly with open disapproval. The atmosphere had transformed. What began as quiet humiliation had become a shared story, a communal recognition of injustice. Jonathan leaned close once more, his voice a low murmur. 25 minutes. That's all they have left. Naomi's eyes stayed fixed on the window, the clouds peeling away as the ground drew closer. "Yes," she said calmly. And then the real reckoning begins. Her abdomen pulsed with pain, but her spirit was unbroken. She knew what was waiting on the ground officials in dark suits, corporate executives scrambling, the weight of accountability descending as swiftly as the aircraft itself. Kelly glanced once more down the aisle, her eyes meeting Naomi's for the briefest second. What she saw there, calm, pain, and undeniable strength, made her stomach twist. She looked away quickly, her mask of confidence gone completely. Linda, too, felt the shift. She had built her authority on procedure, on the expectation of compliance, but compliance had been shattered, replaced by something far more dangerous: truth armed with dignity. The cabin hummed with tension, the hum of engines mixing with whispers, the smell of coffee lingering faintly from service. Naomi sat in the middle of it all, silent, dignified, enduring. She had been denied, dismissed, humiliated, but in 25 minutes, the balance of power would change forever. The sky had turned against her oppressors, and there would be no escape when the wheels touched the ground. The descent continued, engines pulling back as Flight 627 angled downward through smooth Midwestern air. The cabin buzzed with muted whispers. Naomi Carter kept her eyes on the window, watching the sun slash across layered clouds, each band of light a reminder that the world outside carried on, oblivious to the drama unfolding in this pressurized cylinder. Her abdomen ached more sharply now. Each wave of discomfort came quicker, forcing her to close her eyes briefly and steady her breathing. Jonathan noticed, his grip tightening around her hand. He wanted to shout, to demand attention from every crew member within earshot. But Naomi's calm had kept him anchored. He could not break now. At the front of the plane, Captain Amelia Rourke summoned Linda Graves back into the cockpit. The purser entered stiffly, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Kelly Monroe lingered outside, pretending to check service carts, but clearly straining to hear. Inside, the atmosphere was taut. First Officer Daniel Perez sat with his headset slightly askew. His eyes locked on the instruments, but his jaw set in silent judgment. Captain Rourke's gaze was sharp as she turned toward Linda. "Explain to me exactly what happened with the passenger in 14A, the captain demanded. Linda cleared her throat, her voice careful. She was insistent on using the lavatory. I told her we were preparing for descent, which is standard procedure. That's not true. Captain Rourke cut in, her voice flat. We weren't preparing for descent. You know it. I know it. We were cruising over Indiana at 37,000 feet. Why did you tell her otherwise? Linda's mouth opened, then closed. The clipboard trembled faintly in her hands. I was following precedent. She was demanding. She claimed to be an FAA consultant. She is an FAA consultant, the captain snapped, her patience thinning. Doctor, Naomi Carter is one of the most respected aerospace medicine experts in the country. Her research has directly influenced the very protocols we follow. Do you understand what you've done? Linda's face drained of color. She stumbled over her words. I didn't think. That's the problem, Rourke said coldly. You didn't think. You dismissed her, lied to her, and now the FAA is forcing us into an unscheduled diversion. Do you have any idea how serious this is? The first officer spoke up, his voice low but cutting. We're descending into O'Hare with priority vectors. That doesn't happen unless Washington is on the line. Whatever you thought this was, it isn't just a bathroom dispute anymore. It's a federal crisis. Linda's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. The reality pressed down on her, heavy and undeniable. She had wielded her uniform like a weapon, but in doing so, she had pointed it at the wrong target. Captain Rourke leaned closer, her voice dangerous in its quiet. When we land, the FAA will be waiting. You and Monroe will be questioned. Choose your words carefully, because they will decide whether this ends with a suspension or with the end of your career. Linda nodded stiffly, unable to find words. She turned and left the cockpit, her face pale, her once unshakable posture collapsing. Kelly glanced at her as she stepped out, searching for reassurance, but found only silence. Linda brushed past her, shoulders tense, eyes avoiding every passenger she passed. Back in row 14, Naomi sensed the shift. She didn't know the exact words exchanged in the cockpit, but she felt the tremors ripple outward. Linda's rigid mask was cracking. Kelly's movements had lost their rhythm, and the passengers, they weren't just watching anymore. They were aligning. The young couple 2 rows back spoke louder now. She looks like she's in pain. They should have helped her. A man across the aisle muttered, This is cruel. Absolutely cruel. Naomi kept her gaze forward, breathing slow, allowing the truth to unfold on its own. She didn't need to plead. She didn't need to dramatize. The system she trusted was already at work. Jonathan leaned close, voice low. They're unraveling. Naomi nodded slightly. The truth always unravels arrogance. Her phone buzzed once more. She glanced down discreetly. A second message had arrived. Hard stand assigned. FAA team inbound. Hold steady. She closed her eyes, exhaling relief. The cavalry wasn't just coming. It was already in motion. Jonathan saw the flicker of calm in her face and felt some of his own tension ease. We'll be on the ground soon, he whispered. Yes, Naomi said, her tone measured. And when we land, the reckoning begins. At the front of the cabin, Linda tried to resume her duties, but every passenger she passed seemed to pierce her with silent judgment. Kelly's hands shook as she collected empty cups, her eyes darting nervously toward row 14 again and again. They could feel it. Authority had shifted. The uniforms no longer carried power. Dignity did. As the aircraft cut through descending layers of cloud, Chicago sprawled faintly below, a grid of streets and shimmering glass towers catching the late afternoon light. The city grew clearer, closer, every second a countdown to confrontation. Naomi sat upright, her face composed despite the fire in her abdomen. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Every passenger watching, every whisper exchanged, every judgment forming, this was about something larger. This was about prejudice exposed, power abused, and justice closing in with the inevitability of landing gear locking into place. The engines roared gently as flaps extended, the cabin trembling faintly with descent. Naomi's hand tightened in Jonathan's, and she spoke softly, more to herself than to him. They thought I was powerless, but they were wrong. Jonathan's eyes glistened, his voice steady. They'll learn soon enough. And as the aircraft cut through the final veil of clouds, lining up for O'Hare's runways, everyone on board knew the truth. The sky itself had turned into a courtroom, and the verdict was about to be delivered. The aircraft broke through the final layer of clouds, revealing Chicago spread wide beneath them. Afternoon light glinted off Lake Michigan, a sheet of silver stretching to the horizon. The passengers of Flight 627 pressed against their windows, murmuring at the unexpected sight. They knew they were supposed to land in New York. Something had changed, and every one of them could feel it in their bones. The intercom clicked again. Captain Rourke's voice was calm, but there was an edge of gravity beneath her professionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, as announced earlier, we are diverting to Chicago O'Hare International Airport due to a passenger medical situation. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened as we complete our approach. We will be on the ground shortly. Her words did little to quiet the speculation. A man near the back whispered loudly, "It's her, isn't it? That woman in the middle section." Another replied, "Yeah. I saw them arguing with her earlier. They wouldn't let her use the bathroom." The narrative had escaped the crew's control. Naomi Carter sat with her hands folded, her breathing steady despite the pain tightening across her abdomen. Her face betrayed nothing, but Jonathan, sitting beside her, could see the tiny tremors in her hands. He squeezed them gently, whispering, "Just a little longer. We're almost through this." Naomi's eyes remained on the window. The skyline loomed closer, steel and glass jutting against the sky. She thought of all the times she had landed in Chicago for conferences, the sterile airport lounges, the rushed connections. Never had she imagined arriving like this, escorted not by colleagues but by federal authority. Behind her, Kelly Monroe collected empty cups with clumsy hands. Her composure had shattered. Every passenger who looked at her seemed to carry judgment in their eyes. She avoided their stares, focusing on the cart, on anything but the truth pressing in from all sides. Linda Graves stood stiffly in the galley, her clipboard pressed flat against her chest like armor. She could hear the whispers, feel the shift in energy, but she forced herself to remain upright. She had weathered storms before. This one, she told herself, would pass too. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the landing gear deployed. The familiar thump sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. For Naomi, it was a signal. Every second now was part of the countdown. Marcus Hill's last message still echoed in her mind, FAA officials on standby. Jonathan leaned close. "When we land, do you want me to speak for us?" Naomi shook her head gently. "No, my voice. This is my fight." He nodded, his respect deepening, even in pain. She carried herself with an authority no one could strip away. The runway rushed up to meet them. Tires screeched against asphalt, the plane jolting as reverse thrust roared. The cabin swayed, passengers gripping armrests. Within moments, they slowed to a crawl. But instead of turning toward the bustling terminals, the aircraft veered sharply toward a remote corner of the airport. Confusion spread quickly. "Why are we taxiing this way?" someone asked. Another voice answered, "This isn't the terminal." "Where are we going?" Naomi already knew. A hard stand, remote, away from public eyes, controlled, out the windows. Passengers spotted the waiting vehicles, 2 black sedans with government plates, a white van marked with the airline's corporate logo, and several figures in dark suits standing with folded arms. The sight silenced the cabin. Whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. The aircraft came to a stop on the lonely patch of concrete. The engine spooled down into an eerie quiet. For a moment, only the faint hum of ventilation filled the air. Captain Rourke's voice returned, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until we receive further instructions." A hush fell. Eyes darted between Naomi, the galley crew, and the dark suits outside. The atmosphere was no longer simple unease. It was judgment suspended in air, waiting to land. Naomi sat tall, her pain flaring, but her dignity unbroken. Jonathan squeezed her hand once more. "It's time." "Yes," she said softly. "It's time." The forward door opened with a metallic click. But it wasn't a gate agent who appeared. It was a ground operations supervisor in a reflective vest, stepping aside to allow the first figure through. A tall man in a tailored suit entered the cabin, his presence commanding instant silence. His voice carried with the authority of decades in federal service. "Captain Rourke." She rose from her seat near the cockpit. "I'm Captain Amelia Rourke. I'm Marcus Hill, Federal Aviation Administration," the man said, flashing credentials that glinted under cabin lights. The name carried weight, even among those who didn't recognize it. His voice alone told them everything. This was not routine. Marcus scanned the cabin, his eyes sharp but controlled. He found Naomi almost instantly. Recognition softened his features slightly, though his tone remained professional. "Dr. Carter, we're here for you." Gasps spread among the passengers. Confirmation. The woman who had been humiliated, denied, treated as a problem. She was someone of immense consequence. Naomi rose slowly, Jonathan's arm steady at her side. Pain etched across her face, but dignity wrapped around her like armor. She met Marcus with a nod. "Thank you for your prompt response." "It was the least we could do," Marcus replied, his voice low but firm. He gestured to one of his aides. "Escort Dr. Carter and her husband to the vehicle. Medical staff are waiting." As Naomi and Jonathan walked forward, the cabin erupted in something unexpected. A single passenger began to clap, slow and deliberate. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, half the cabin was applauding, not out of cheerfulness, but as a profound show of respect. Naomi paused at the threshold, turning slightly toward them. Her eyes glistened, but her expression remained composed. She gave a small nod, then stepped off the aircraft. The applause lingered even after she disappeared into the waiting sedan. Inside the plane, Marcus Hill turned his gaze to Linda Graves and Kelly Monroe. His voice cut through the silence, flat as granite. "Purser Graves, Flight Attendant Monroe, surrender your crew IDs and passports. You are grounded pending immediate investigation." The silence shattered with a gasp. Kelly's knees wobbled, her voice trembling. I was just following instructions." Marcus looked at her with cold precision. "The rules you thought you were following don't exist. The rules you broke are very real." Linda's face hardened, but the clipboard in her arms trembled visibly. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Passengers watched, their judgment no longer whispered, but written plainly in their stares. The uniforms that once symbolized authority now marked disgrace. The reckoning had begun, and it was only the first chapter. The sedan door shut softly behind Naomi Carter. She leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling a slow breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. Jonathan slid in beside her, his hand steady on her arm. Through the tinted glass, she caught a final glimpse of the aircraft standing isolated on the hard stand, surrounded by black sedans and flashing lights. It looked less like a plane, preparing passengers for a connection, and more like a crime scene preserved for investigation. A young medic in a Navy uniform knelt beside her. "Dr. Carter, my name is Alexis. I'm here to check your vitals before we move you further. Can you tell me your pain level?" Naomi gave a faint smile despite the sharp pang in her abdomen. "Manageable. For now." Jonathan frowned. "That's not true. She's been in pain for almost an hour." She was denied relief. The medic's eyes flickered, then softened. "We'll take care of her, sir." She wrapped a cuff around Naomi's arm, inflating it briskly. Naomi focused on the rhythmic squeeze, grounding herself in the small mechanical sound. Outside the sedan, Marcus Hill spoke quietly with his team. His tall frame was rigid, his words clipped. "Escort the Carters to the private lounge. Medical team continues assessment there. I'll remain on site." He turned, his gaze falling once more on the aircraft. Inside, Linda Graves and Kelly Monroe sat stiffly in jump seats, their faces pale. The passengers whispered openly now, no longer afraid to assign blame. Authority had inverted. Back on the plane, the silence pressed heavily. The ground operations supervisor stood near the forward door, arms folded, waiting for Marcus's signal. He knew the protocol the FAA led. The airline followed. Linda tried to collect herself. She smoothed her uniform with trembling hands, willing her voice to remain steady. "This is out of proportion," she whispered to Kelly. It's political. It'll blow over." Kelly's voice cracked. "Linda, they took her off with the FAA. Did you see the applause everyone knows?" "Passengers exaggerate," Linda said quickly. Though her tone lacked conviction, they didn't understand procedure. Kelly shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No, Linda, they understood exactly what happened, and so does he." She gestured toward Marcus Hill, visible through the window as he conferred with two officials. The purser said nothing. For the first time in her long career, her authority meant nothing. In the sedan, Naomi leaned her head against the cool glass, finally allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. The adrenaline that had kept her steady began to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion. Jonathan brushed his thumb gently over her knuckles. "You held yourself with so much grace," he murmured. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." Naomi's eyes fluttered shut. Because anger would have given them what they wanted. Dignity was the only weapon I had. Jonathan swallowed hard. Pride and sorrow tangled in his chest. "You shouldn't have needed to fight at all." She opened her eyes, meeting his, "But I did. And now, the system has to answer for it." At the aircraft door, Marcus finally stepped back inside. His presence alone silenced the cabin again. He stood in the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the passengers before fixing on Linda and Kelly. "Graves, Monroe," he said, his tone precise. "You will deplane now. You will be escorted to a secure conference room inside the terminal for questioning. You are not to speak to each other. You are not to contact anyone." "Do you understand?" Linda tried to answer, but her voice faltered. "Sir." "Do you understand?" Marcus repeated, sharper. She swallowed hard. "Yes." Kelly nodded quickly, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes." The passengers watched, silent but unrelenting in their judgment, as the two women stood and surrendered their crew IDs. The uniforms that once gave them authority now looked like costumes stripped of power. A man near the middle rows muttered, "Good riddance," loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Others nodded in agreement. As Linda and Kelly were escorted off, their eyes avoided the passengers. But avoiding the truth was impossible. Every whisper, every stare pressed against them like a wall of condemnation. Outside, cameras flashed from a distance airport staff with phones, ground crew murmuring, word already leaking into the outside world. The scandal was alive before the investigation had even begun. Marcus remained at the aircraft door, addressing the cabin with measured gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the FAA, I apologize for the disruption. This aircraft will taxi shortly to a gate for rebooking and compensation. Thank you for your cooperation." His words carried authority, but the passengers hardly needed them. They had witnessed enough to understand that this day was historic. In the private lounge, Naomi was settled into a reclining chair. The medic handed her a glass of water, watching carefully as she sipped. Jonathan hovered close, still protective. Marcus entered quietly a few minutes later, removing his jacket and placing it neatly over a chair. His face softened as he looked at Naomi. "You handled yourself with remarkable composure," he said. "I'm sorry you had to endure this." Naomi inclined her head. "It wasn't just me. Every passenger saw. That's what matters." Marcus nodded. "And they'll testify if necessary. But the records, the timeline, the diversion order, that's already enough." His eyes hardened. "The crew's careers are finished. The airline will face consequences." Jonathan spoke up, his voice firm. "And the pattern. This wasn't random. You need to look at their past behavior." Marcus's gaze was steady. "Oh, we will. And when we find it, and we will, it won't just end two careers. It'll expose a culture." Naomi leaned back, fatigue washing over her. For the first time since standing in that aisle, she allowed herself to rest. Yet beneath her exhaustion, a quiet certainty pulsed. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond this single flight. Back on the aircraft, passengers began collecting their belongings, readying for the slow taxi to a gate. But what they carried with them was more than luggage. They carried a story, one they would tell at dinner tables, on social media, in offices. A story of a woman denied dignity and the swift justice that followed. Linda and Kelly sat in separate sedans, silent, pale, their uniforms wrinkled, their futures collapsing behind them with every passing second. Naomi, sipping water in the quiet lounge, whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "It wasn't just about me. It was about what happens when you strip someone of dignity at 37,000 feet. The sky itself will demand an answer." The conference room inside O'Hare's secure terminal wing was bare and sterile, its white walls humming faintly with fluorescent light. A long table stretched across the center, flanked by 2 chairs on one side and 3 on the other. A digital recorder sat in the middle, its tiny red light waiting. Linda Graves sat stiffly, her uniform rumpled, clipboard gone. For the first time in 25 years, she felt stripped of everything that had once made her matter. Kelly Monroe sat in another room down the hall, separated deliberately to prevent rehearsed stories. The air itself felt heavy, as if the silence carried judgment before a single question was asked. Across from Linda sat two FAA investigators and Marcus Hill. His jacket was still draped neatly over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "State your name and position." One investigator began. Voice clipped. "Linda Graves." "Purser. Ascend Airlines," she answered, her tone dry but faintly trembling. Marcus leaned forward. "Ms. Graves, let's start simply. Did you deny Dr. Naomi Carter access to the lavatory?" Linda's throat tightened. "Yes. I told her the lavatory was unavailable." On what grounds? She hesitated. "Preparations for descent." Marcus's gaze cut like glass. "You were at 37,000 feet over Indiana, 90 minutes from landing. Preparations had not begun." "Why did you tell her otherwise?" Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Her rehearsed defenses shrank beneath the weight of the evidence already stacked against her. "It was a judgment call," she said finally, her voice brittle. She was assertive. "I didn't want disruption." Marcus's voice dropped, controlled but piercing. "A judgment call. You lied to a passenger with a medical need. That's not judgment. That's negligence." One of the investigators slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of passenger witness statements collected within the hour. Words like dismissive, condescending, targeted filled the pages. Linda's hands twitched. Passengers exaggerate. They don't understand protocol. Marcus's expression didn't change. They don't need to. The cockpit voice recorder will confirm what Dr. Carter said, that you fabricated descent preparations. You didn't just bend the truth, you weaponized it. Her shoulders sagged. The truth pressed too heavily to resist. "Down the hall." Kelly Monroe twisted her hands in her lap as a second team questioned her. Her eyes darted between the investigators, her voice cracking under the pressure. "She told me, Linda, told me to hold firm," Kelly blurted, her words tumbling fast. "She said passengers like that always push, and if I gave in, I'd never move up. She told me this was the way to prove I could be purser one day." The investigators exchanged glances. Passengers like that one repeated. Kelly's face flushed. She meant people who bend rules, who act entitled. Or did she mean something else? The investigator asked evenly. Kelly's silence was louder than words. Back in the lounge, Naomi Carter sat upright, sipping ginger tea provided by a sympathetic attendant. Jonathan hovered close, though the lines in his face had softened now that the immediate crisis had passed. Naomi's body was still aching, but her mind had sharpened again. "Do you think they'll admit what they did?" Jonathan asked quietly. Naomi shook her head. "Not willingly, but the evidence will speak. It always does." Her phone buzzed again. A message from Marcus. "Interrogations underway. Pattern emerging. We'll update soon." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, relief mixing with exhaustion. This was no longer just about her pain. It was about exposing something systemic, something festering beneath the surface of procedure. Hours later, Marcus returned to the lounge. His face was set, but his eyes softened when he looked at Naomi. "We've concluded preliminary questioning," he said, "and it's worse than a single incident." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus sat across from them, his tone deliberate. "We pulled internal records. Over the last 3 years, both Graves and Monroe have been named in multiple complaints, 6 involving Monroe, 4 involving Graves directly. In every case, the passengers were people of color. The language was consistent, dismissive, rude, sometimes outright hostile. Graves cleared Monroe each time, writing, "Passenger non-compliant. Procedure followed." Jonathan's jaw tightened. So this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Yes, Marcus said grimly. A pattern protected by a supervisor who should have known better. The investigation will confirm it formally. But from where I sit, this was systemic abuse of authority. Naomi exhaled slowly, her voice quiet but firm. That's what I felt in that aisle. It wasn't about procedure. It was about power and prejudice. Marcus nodded. And now, it will be documented. They've already contradicted each other in questioning. Monroe tried to shift blame onto Graves, producing old text messages praising her for being tough on passengers. Graves, in turn, claimed Monroe misled her. Their alliance has collapsed. Jonathan allowed himself a grim smile. They're eating each other alive. Naomi's expression remained calm, though her voice carried a note of sadness. That doesn't undo the harm they caused to others before me. People who didn't have the leverage I had. Marcus leaned forward. That's why this won't just stop with them. Ascend Airlines will face oversight. The FAA will require systemic reform. You've given us the lever we needed. For a long moment, Naomi sat in silence, the weight of it settling. She hadn't asked to be the fulcrum of change, but if that was the role, she would not shrink from it. Back in their separate rooms, Linda and Kelly waited. Linda stared at the blank wall, her years of service unraveling in her mind, memories of flights and passengers blurred by the single mistake that had exposed the truth she had hidden. Kelly sat hunched, her phone confiscated, her future shrinking into the same narrow space as her regret. The passengers of Flight 627 had long since been escorted to the terminal, where rumors spread like wildfire across social media. Posts appeared within minutes. FAA boarded our flight. Applause for passenger denied bathroom. Airline in big trouble. The narrative had escaped into the world. Naomi rested her head back against the chair. Jonathan covered her hand with his own. "You started this," he whispered. "No," Naomi corrected softly. "They did. I only refused to accept it." The night deepened outside O'Hare's windows, but inside the sterile rooms, the reckoning had only just begun. By morning, the story had left the sterile walls of O'Hare and ignited across the digital world. What began as murmurs among passengers transformed into a firestorm of hashtags, think pieces, and viral posts. The first spark came from Greg Finch, the businessman who had started the applause on the plane. On LinkedIn, he published a long, detailed post. I watched a brilliant, dignified black woman. Later I learned she was Dr. Naomi Carter be denied the most basic human dignity on our flight. What followed was a masterclass in composure and a catastrophic failure of authority. The FAA diverted us mid-air, and when officials boarded, passengers clapped her off the plane. I've never seen anything like it, and I never want to see it again. Within hours, his post had been shared tens of thousands of times. Screenshots flooded Twitter and Facebook. Headlines appeared across news outlets. Passenger denied bathroom, FAA forces diversion, and doctor humiliated on FlightSpark's federal investigation. Ascend Airlines scrambled to respond. Their public relations team drafted a vague statement at dawn. Ascend Airlines prioritizes the safety and dignity of all passengers. We are cooperating fully with the FAA regarding an incident on Flight 627. but the internet was already dissecting every word. The lack of apology only fueled the outrage. Naomi sat in the quiet of a hotel suite provided by the FAA, her body finally recovering from the ordeal. Jonathan scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightening at the headlines. "They're calling it the flight that changed everything," he muttered. Naomi sipped her tea, her voice measured. "The headlines don't matter. What matters is whether change follows." Jonathan set the phone down, looking at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "You know they're going to come for you now. Interviews, cameras, all of it. You didn't ask for this, Naomi." She met his gaze steadily. "I didn't ask, but I won't hide. If my silence protects a system that harmed me, then I become complicit. I won't be that." Across the city, Linda Graves sat in a hotel room paid for by the airline, her career unraveling in real time. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, some sympathetic, most horrified. Her face was splashed across news sites under headlines like, "Purser at Center of FAA Diversion." She stared at the screen, numb. Kelly Monroe, meanwhile, had retreated to her parents' home in Ohio. She locked herself in her childhood bedroom, scrolling endlessly as her name trended. Old social media posts resurfaced sarcastic jokes about passengers, tone-deaf comments about knowing how to keep control. Each one was dissected, each one reinforcing the story of a toxic attitude now laid bare. Back at Ascend Airlines headquarters, executives huddled in a glass-walled conference room. The CEO's face was red with anger, his voice echoing, "We are staring at the worst PR crisis in this airline's history. A diverted flight, an FAA investigation, and every major outlet running the same narrative discrimination at 37,000 feet. This will cost us millions, maybe more." The VP of Operations, Frank Donovan, sat grimly silent. He had been on the call with Marcus Hill during the diversion. He knew the gravity better than anyone. "It's not just PR," he said finally. "It's liability. Dr. Carter is an FAA consultant. She knows the regulations better than half this building, and she has the credibility to take us apart piece by piece." The CEO slammed his hand on the table. "Then what do we do?" "Damage control," Donovan replied, "and reforms. Real ones. If we don't, the FAA will bury us." By afternoon, Naomi received the first request a national morning show wanted her on live television. Jonathan frowned at the email. "They want you front and center. Are you ready for that?" Naomi leaned back. "Considering. I'll do it, but I won't perform for their ratings. I'll speak for the people who didn't have the chance to fight back." That night, Naomi sat under studio lights, her posture calm, her voice steady. She recounted the events in detail, not with dramatics, but with precision. She described the pain of being denied, the humiliation of being dismissed, and the quiet certainty that led her to contact the FAA. The host asked, "Did you ever think it would escalate the way it did?" Naomi's eyes were steady. "I didn't think about escalation. I thought about survival. And then I thought about accountability. Too often, people in positions of small authority wield it like a weapon. That day, I refused to let it cut me down." The clip went viral before the interview even ended. Comments poured in. "Her grace is unmatched. This is how systemic problems are exposed. She's the hero we didn't know we needed." Jonathan sat in the wings, watching his wife with awe. She wasn't just surviving the firestorm, she was shaping it. Back at FAA headquarters in Washington, Marcus Hill read the transcripts of her interview and smiled faintly. Naomi had done more in a single appearance than weeks of reports could accomplish. She had humanized the issue. turning a policy violation into a moral reckoning. And at Ascend Airlines, panic deepened. The PR team scrambled to draft a second statement, this time including an apology, but it was too late. The public had already decided Naomi Carter was the face of dignity, and Ascend Airlines was the villain. Passengers from other flights began sharing their own stories. A woman recalled being denied a seat upgrade after medical disclosure. A man recounted being spoken down to with hostility. The airline's inbox flooded with old wounds suddenly brought back to light. Naomi scrolled through some of the stories late at night, her heart heavy. She whispered to Jonathan, "This was never just me. I was only the moment when it became undeniable." He brushed her shoulder softly. "And now you're the moment that forces change." The firestorm raged on, unstoppable, and Naomi knew the reckoning had not reached its peak. The hardest part was still to come, forcing a corporation to not just apologize, but to rebuild itself from the inside out. Weeks after Flight 627, the scandal no longer belonged to a single airline. It had become a national conversation. News anchors debated it nightly. Editorials framed it as a turning point. The question wasn't whether Ascend Airlines had failed, but whether the entire industry was complicit in quiet patterns of abuse. Naomi Carter watched it unfold from the periphery, her face now familiar across media, but her spirit unchanged. She spent her mornings reading medical journals, her evenings with Jonathan over simple meals. She had not sought fame, but it had found her. What mattered to her was whether it led to substance, not spectacle. In a downtown Chicago courtroom, the first hearings began. Ascend Airlines faced a lawsuit spearheaded by Naomi and Jonathan, joined by passengers from past complaints who had endured similar treatment. The plaintiffs were a mosaic of backgrounds and stories, united by the same quiet indignities. The airline's lawyers attempted a narrow defense, framing the incident as isolated misconduct. But the evidence was relentless. FAA transcripts, cockpit voice recordings, internal complaint files all converged into a damning pattern. Jonathan stood before the judge, his voice steady. "This is not about a single lavatory dispute. This is about dignity denied, again and again, hidden under false claims of procedure. It is about an airline that allowed prejudice to masquerade as authority until one passenger refused to be silent." Naomi watched him from the gallery, pride swelling quietly. His words were her truth spoken in another register. When Linda Graves took the stand, her composure cracked. She admitted to dismissing complaints, to writing off passengers as non-compliant. She tried to frame it as fatigue, as the strain of years of service, but under cross-examination, her own text messages to Kelly emerged messages praising standing firm against passengers who push. Kelly followed, her testimony halting, remorse written in her trembling voice. She admitted she wanted promotion, that she mirrored Linda's behavior to prove her worth. Tears streamed as she whispered, "I thought I was doing what the airline wanted, but I see now I was wrong. I hurt people who didn't deserve it." The courtroom was silent. The reckoning was complete. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones capturing every word. Headlines declared Ascend settles with passengers' 8-figure payout, consent decree with FAA. But Naomi and Jonathan declined personal compensation. Instead, their portion was redirected to a new foundation, the Carter Aviation Justice Project, dedicated to defending passengers facing discrimination in travel. For Naomi, the real victory came weeks later in a quiet boardroom. She sat across from Ascend Airlines executives, including Frank Donovan, the VP who now looked 10 years older from the strain of crisis management. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone subdued. The FAA has mandated new training across our airline. They've also asked for you to design it. Naomi inclined her head, calm but resolute. Not asked, she corrected softly. Required. Frank nodded. Required. For the next year. Naomi poured herself into the work. She crafted modules that forced employees to confront bias, to understand passenger rights, to de-escalate rather than dominate. She used Flight 627, anonymized but unmistakable, as a central case study. Trainees watched a reenactment of a passenger denied a bathroom and then asked to reflect, what would you have done differently? It was uncomfortable. It was raw. But it was effective. Other airlines licensed the program, eager to avoid their own crises. Soon, what had begun as a humiliation became the gold standard for training across the industry. One evening, Naomi flew again, this time to deliver a keynote in Washington. As she settled into her seat, a young flight attendant approached cautiously. Dr. Carter, she asked. Naomi looked up, surprised. I just finished the training you designed, the attendant said, her voice earnest. It changed how I see my job. Yesterday, a passenger asked for the lavatory during turbulence, and instead of snapping, I listened. I found a safe solution. It made a difference. So, thank you. Naomi's eyes softened. You don't need to thank me. Just keep treating people with dignity. That's all that matters. The plane lifted into the night, engines humming, the same sterile air she had once feared now carrying her into new purpose. Back on the ground, Linda Graves lived in obscurity, her pension gone, her reputation ruined. Kelly Monroe worked in retail quietly, trying to rebuild a life. Their names faded into cautionary tales, whispered in crew lounges as examples of what arrogance could destroy. Naomi, by contrast, became more than a cautionary tale. She became a reformer. Years later, as she watched a passenger in another cabin quietly escorted to the lavatory despite turbulence, she felt a small, then private smile. The change was real. It would ripple outward, touching millions of travelers who would never know her name, only the dignity they were afforded. Jonathan once asked her, as they walked hand in hand through an airport terminal. Do you ever wish none of it had happened? Naomi thought for a long moment. I wish I hadn't felt that pain, that humiliation. But without it, nothing would have changed. Sometimes, the sky has to break before it learns to carry us better. And with that, she boarded another flight not as a victim, not as a headline, but as the quiet architect of a legacy that stretched across the very skies where it had all begun. What began as a denial of a simple human need ended as a lesson written into the very fabric of aviation. Dr. Naomi Carter's story is more than one passenger's ordeal. It is a reminder that power, when twisted by prejudice, can wound deeply. But it also shows us that dignity, held firmly and quietly, can change everything. The flight attendants who mocked her authority lost not just their jobs, but their legacy. The airline that ignored its passengers was forced to rebuild from the inside out. And from that crucible, Naomi transformed pain into purpose, establishing reforms, founding the Carter Aviation Justice Project, and ensuring that no traveler would again be silenced at 37,000 feet. But beyond the lawsuits, beyond the policies, lies the deeper truth. Every act of bias leaves a scar. Every denial of dignity shapes the world we live in. And every refusal to stay silent plants the seed of change. So the next time you step onto a plane, ask yourself who is sitting beside you. What battles are they carrying quietly? And will you choose silence? Or will you choose to stand for respect? If this story touched you, if it left you with anger, hope, or a deeper sense of justice, please like this video, share it widely, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more true stories of dignity, struggle, and transformation to light.